So thank you all for joining us today for Animal Matters. Those of you in person and on Zoom, welcome to everyone. My name is Megan Mueller, and I'm one of the faculty members at the Center for Animals and Public Policy. And we are really thrilled to have Lauren Loney with us today. I met Lauren at a conference this summer and immediately thought we absolutely need to have her come to Tufts to give a talk. So I'm really thrilled that she has joined us today. So Lauren is a licensed attorney, researcher, and advocate with more than 8 years of experience crafting policies and lobbying on a variety of issues at all levels of the government. She previously served as staff attorney and policy specialist for Human Animal Support Services, where she implemented the organization's first equity-centered policy agenda and spearheaded research related to pets relinquished due to housing issues. Prior to joining Haas, Lauren worked as the state director for the HSUS, where she successfully worked to pass ordinances in Houston and Dallas, banning the retail sale of puppies and kittens in pet stores, and led state legislative efforts on a variety of policies, including public contact with dangerous wild animals and pets in rental housing. She received her BS in Fisheries and Wildlife Biology from Mizzou and MS in Aquatic Resources from Texas State University, and graduated with honors from the University of Texas Law School in 2017. So thank you to Lauren for taking the time to join us today, and we really appreciate you being here, and we will let you take it away. So thank you.
Again, can you all hear me okay? Okay. Well, thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with me and for the invitation to be here. I'm very excited to share with y'all a little bit about some of the research that I've had the real pleasure of being able to collaborate on in my time in the animal welfare space. And today we're going to be going over some insights from a few different studies on the consequences of America's affordable housing crisis on people, pets, and animal shelters. As Megan mentioned, I do have a background in environmental science. I would not say that my path to what I work on now has been a particularly straight line. You can see my master's thesis here had nothing to do with the subject matter that I work on today. But it was really during my time getting my master's degree that I realized how much I wanted my career to be grounded in bridging the gap between science and research and the creation of effective public policy. So I graduated from Texas law with the intent of going into a pretty traditional water law practice. But as these things do happen when you get your first positions out of school, I had a 2-year fellowship with the university where I was introduced to my first affordable housing project, specifically focused on the preservation of affordable housing in the state of Texas, where I'm from. And that project really changed my trajectory. After that fellowship, I became the co-director of advocacy and research for an Austin-based nonprofit called Texas Housers. And that is where, when I began to truly understand what I believe, which is that access to housing, safe, affordable housing, is the root of essentially every other systemic issue that we have in our society and across the world. I did maintain my toes. I kept my toes in the animal welfare space during this time through volunteer work, working on policy advocacy at the Texas Capitol. And that's when it really hit me that housing and animal welfare, companion animal welfare in particular, are directly linked, and that the issues that are impacting our most vulnerable and lowest income renters are also impacting the pets that live with them. So when I had the opportunity to take on the role as Texas State Director at the HSUS, I used that position and every position since to really lean into this intersectional space with a very intentional purpose to sort of unsilo the work that housing justice advocates do and that animal welfare advocates do. So today I'm going to give a really high-level overview of the affordable housing crisis, who it impacts the most, dive into how pets and their families and our animal sheltering resources are impacted by this crisis, and then go over what I think are some of the policy solutions that our research really is informing about how to mitigate the flow of pets relinquished to animal shelters due to underlying housing insecurity. Our affordable housing crisis is not new. It's been decades in the making, particularly for our lowest income renters. This is a map by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, a fantastic organization if you're interested in housing work. They produce this report every year called The Gap, which shows us that across the country, there is not a single state that has enough affordable and available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income households. So the more red the state on this map, the worse they're doing. And the lighter the yellow, the better they're doing. So Massachusetts is actually doing quite well relative to other states, but quite well still means only 46 available and affordable homes for every 100 extremely low income families in the state. And the primary reason why we are seeing this issue is because of decades of wages not keeping up with the increasing costs of rent. If you look back to the 1960s, you'll find that wages, when accounting for inflation, have only increased by about 5%. Cost of rent has increased over the same time period by 60%. As a result, we have millions of households who are severely rent cost burdened, which means that they spend greater than 50% of their total monthly household income just on housing expenses, which you can imagine leaves very little money left over for other basic needs, including pet care, or any type of emergency, really. And the consequences of our housing crisis are not felt race neutrally. Historical, overtly racist policies like redlining and more covertly racist policies such as placement of highways, deed restrictions, and who people can sell homes to, even the placement of affordable housing today, has led to a strongly disparate impact of the consequences of lack of housing on households of color. Today, how many of y'all are familiar with redlining? Okay, a fair number of you, that's excellent. It's normally not that high, so I'm really glad to see that. So today, what we see is that 60% of formerly redlined neighborhoods remain just as or almost as racially and economically segregated as they were in the 1930s when these policies were passed. And the flip side is true. 2/3 of desirable neighborhoods today remain almost exclusively whiter and wealthier. Additionally, formerly red and yellow, so undesirably defined neighborhoods, have significantly less access to green spaces and public infrastructure like sidewalks that help people to feel at home and healthy in their rental housing. The situation is so significant, how housing impacts us is so significant that research shows that your zip code is a better predictor of your health outcome than your genetic code. And if that alone isn't enough to tell us how important housing is, I don't know what else could be. So how do we know that all of this is impacting pets and their families? One really significant data point here is that the industry estimates that just under 3/4 of renter households have at least one pet. That means millions of pets are living with renters, which are increasingly housing insecure as the years go on. We know that about half of all renters are housing cost burdened and living with higher housing insecurity. So we can estimate that just under 20 million pets likely live with households, in households where they're experiencing really high levels of housing insecurity. Over the years, we've seen anecdotal evidence and some research that housing is one of the top reasons for pet relinquishment to animal shelters. And data that came out earlier this year from Human Animal Support Services tells us that the vast majority, 80% of the relinquishments, the intakes, which is a broader term, the intakes to this set of animal shelters came from more socially vulnerable communities. Now, so SVI is not a strengths-based assessment, right? There are many things about a community that are not accounted for by SVI that can make it a strong community. But this helps us to understand how the systemic issues impacting our lower income and racially segregated communities are also impacting their ability to keep the pets they love. And we also know that where you live determines your access to all sorts of resources. And we now have, in the last, maybe 5 to 7 years, really developed mapping skills to help us understand that these trends impacting humans and their resources are also impacting pet-related resources. So this is a map of the city of Houston. Most of my examples are from Texas, since that's where I'm from. So what you can see on this map is that areas of concentrated poverty, which are represented here by the darker gray census tracts, are complete resource deserts for pet-related services. And the services that are in the community are highly concentrated in this, what we call in Houston, the wealthy white arrow coming in from the western part of the city into downtown. So we have half of the city almost that at the time this data was collected lacked easy access to resources for pet owners. So since 2020, this is one of my dogs. I have 3. This is Sai. He's very photogenic, so he gets into my presentations a lot. There have been a fair number of recent policy efforts in the last, since 2020, the last 5 years or so, to try and mitigate the lack of access to pet-inclusive housing. And these policies can be sort of bucketed. Can you hear a high-pitched buzz? No? Okay, I can hear it, but no, I think it's okay. So these recent policy efforts can be bucketed really into 3 different categories. We have policies impacting tenants' rights. This is, for example, where we've worked on policies to protect pets during evictions. We have policies that are related to increasing access to pet-inclusive housing for people who are unhoused and needing emergency housing, and people who are needing to escape situations of domestic or gender-based violence. And then our third broad bucket of policies are those eliminating breed, weight, and size restrictions in just general market rate or affordable housing, eliminating underlying breed restrictions in homeowners insurance, which is a really big part of this conversation, and then regulating the use of pet deposits, non-refundable fees, and monthly pet rents. And that's really where my interest lies, is in that last subject area. So diving into 2 studies that we published this year, just as a caveat, I'm not going to go into the methods in these studies just for the purpose of time, but I'm happy to answer questions about those at the end. So my research cohort and I published this study about halfway through the year. And we looked at housing-related companion animal relinquishments across 21 animal shelters in the US, with the data collected between 2019 and 2023. These animal shelters are all pilot shelters for human animal support services, who I used to work for. And they represent about 15 different states. So we had just over 1 million individual animal intake records. We assessed that data for share of intakes related to housing. We assessed the characteristics of the pets that were relinquished due to housing and what happened to those pets once they came into the shelter. What were their outcomes? We also looked at longitudinal trends. So were we seeing anything changing over time as it relates to pets relinquished due to housing? And then, of course, for my work, I wanted to understand how this data could help inform our policymaking. So animal shelter intake data is notoriously kind of messy. There's been a big effort in the industry to start to standardize intake data so we can better understand why pets are coming into the shelter. So we actually had about 50 different subtypes related to housing among our 28,424 intakes under this category. We bucketed those into these 5 subtypes that you can see here. And when we started to dive into the data, we immediately started to find some interesting things that were different than what we hear about anecdotally. So almost 60% of the pets relinquished were dogs, but more than 1/3 were cats. And that's a really interesting data point whenever you are chatting with folks in the industry who really, they see a lot of these big blocky-headed pit bull type dogs coming into shelters because of lack of access to housing. But cats really weren't getting very much attention in this conversation at all. We did find that more than half of relinquishments fell in this sort of unspecified, miscellaneous moving or housing reasons, where we didn't have any additional information. A third of the intakes were due to pet-specific restrictions, and then just under 8.4% were due to landlord conflict. We also found that while, yes, large dogs did make up the highest percentage of dog relinquishments, small dogs were not far behind, coming in at 19% of pets relinquished due to housing, and we had a very strong bimodal distribution of weights, with peaks at 11 and 51 pounds, which again just speaks a little bit more to this notion that it's not just big dogs that are not finding homes or able to stay in homes because of housing. Over time, we found that cats were actually relinquished at higher rates over time, whereas dogs across the board were being relinquished less and less over time, with large dogs actually being relinquished less at the sharpest decline. We also found a really startling result that intakes due to loss of home have been sharply on the rise between 2019 and 2023. And perhaps on the positive side, intakes due to pet-specific restrictions have been on the decline over time. What this might indicate is that we're actually starting to see increasingly the consequences of the affordable housing crisis on intakes in our animal shelters. And perhaps we're having some positive effects on how strict policies are in market rate housing. We did find that 95% of animals in this data set had a live outcome, which is wonderful, and that pets relinquished by unhoused owners and pit bull type dogs were less likely to have a live outcome. And this question about why pets relinquished by unhoused owners are less likely to have a live outcome is a really important question that we haven't fully sussed out yet, but is definitely a future area of research. I also just want to point out that our shelters in this study were doing a fantastic job of utilizing their traditional animal sheltering outcome programs. A vast majority were transferred out or adopted into new homes. But research does tell us that housing-related intake specifically is the most cited reason for what we call involuntary relinquishment, where people truly don't want to be giving up their pets. And so I think that this data really does support increasing funding for and programmatic capacity for emergency and temporary fostering programming within the animal sheltering space. And perhaps we could actually see this RTO rate in this subset of animals really increase. On the policy side, this data supports a broader focus and policy advocacy than simply advocating for prohibiting breed, weight, or size restrictions. The fact that cat relinquishments were a third of all intakes, small dog relinquishments were also almost as high as large dogs, and relinquishments due to loss of home have been on the rise, all indicate that we should be advocating to remove arbitrary limits to the numbers of pets allowed, that we need to be really concerned about affordability in these contexts, and so either severely limit or entirely disallow the use of non-refundable fees and pet rents, and be more active in the tenants' rights and advocacy space so that we can help pet owners navigate those landlord conflict scenarios that are also responsible for a pretty sizable chunk of relinquishments. The second study I want to chat about today is a qualitative study. It was just published at the end of October, so we're very excited to finally have this study out into the world. This was in collaboration with the University of Denver's Institute for Human-Animal Connection, and we sought to address a real gap in the literature, understanding low-income tenants' lived experiences as it relates to finding and keeping affordable pet-inclusive housing. And then my goal in this study was to co-create policy recommendations with the tenants for policies that would impact their lives today. I'm going to share a few themes from this study. There's a lot in here that I'm not going to dive into, so if this is of interest, I would highly recommend checking out the paper published in Frontiers in Veterinary Science. So one of the main themes, of course, in this study was the importance of tenants to find housing that allows them to bring their pets. This tenant said, quote, "When I left my dog behind, that was a heartbreaking thing. I had to choose if I had to leave him or I had to go out. It's like choosing between life or death." And I think this is something that all of us who have pets can probably relate to, right? The notion of having to choose between a place to live and your pet is not really a choice at all, right? You are giving up a part of your family when you're in this position. Participants also identified affordable housing, so subsidized affordable housing, as having a strong preference for small dogs and often didn't allow certain breeds. You can see that this tenant says there are places that you really like and maybe they don't allow pets at all, but even if they do, they only allow pets under 30 pounds and not my kind of dog. Participants also expressed how limited their options were for housing in general, not even withstanding the pet issue. Participant E discussed how they were on a wait list for 6 years to get access to housing. And whenever they got the call, they stated, quote, "This was like the only option I had." Other participants discussed the added challenges of having records of any kind, whether it was an eviction record or a criminal record. This tenant said, "For me, it's really more about my background that stresses me. That, I don't care how long and how far back it is, there's still that box, and that's discrimination too." So the intersection between interacting with the criminal justice system and access to housing is another area that is deeply, deeply, what's the word? I want to use inappropriate language here, but I won't. It's deeply impactful to tenants, right? And it's another area that animal welfare really needs to be engaged in a more meaningful way. Another theme is that if you have enough money, you can have a pet. This tenant at the top spoke about the lack of respect and dignity in affordable housing. And I want to read a quote from Professor Dan Rose from the University of North Carolina. He has a study that I'm going to reference here in a minute about racial discrimination in pet-related policies and housing. And he says in that paper, "To not feel at home in one's own home is a common feeling among renters, with landlords largely dictating conditions, policies, and even tenant behavior within their property." And he theorizes that whether or not one allows pets and housing is yet another example of landlords controlling low-income tenant lives. Another tenant, as you can see, put it very clearly that this person would love to have a dog, but with the fees the way they are today, they simply can't afford it. Not only is this person not getting to experience the bond with a pet, but this is also a home for somebody who could potentially be adopting a pet from a shelter that's unable to do so. The last themes that I will share here are really important for subsidized affordable housing in particular, which has its own set of struggles in terms of accessing pet-inclusive housing. Lack of clear and upfront communication of pet policies by apartment complexes. This participant was approved at their rental housing. They had done the application process. They'd paid the application fee. And when they brought their dog to meet the property manager, that property manager said, "Oh, you can move in, but you got to get rid of your pit bull." It's completely unacceptable that that policy was not relayed to that tenant much earlier in the process, right? And then finally, there was a strong desire for housing more designed and sited with pets in mind. This is commonly discussed in this theme were areas for people to walk their dogs, having waste bins, having places away from parks with little kids to be able to walk their dogs. All of these things that, frankly, probably most of us take for granted in our daily lives with our pets. So the policy recommendations co-created with tenants, some of them were very similar to what we had already been talking about, but some that were really specific from this group of participants were the policies to require written and consistent pet policies at each subsidized housing property, that those policies should be publicly available and easily accessible. I can tell you from my own experience in trying to survey subsidized housing that it is nearly impossible to get somebody on the phone to explain a pet policy to you. And that's as an attorney doing this for research. Imagine if I was a tenant with almost no choice in the process of trying to find housing and experiencing what it's like to not be able to do that. And then one area that I've worked in and that it really, this study like nailed home for me is that there should be greater work in developing and preserving affordable housing in areas of deconcentrated property where tenants with their pets feel safe to be outside, close to dog-friendly green spaces, and within a reasonable distance of stores providing pet-related policies. So in conclusion, we've been talking a lot in the animal welfare space about pet-inclusive housing and what that means, how do we define it? And I think that our movement needs a shift to not just talking about pet-inclusive housing in general, but equitable access to pet-inclusive housing. And to me, that has kind of 5 subparts based on what we know from housing research and from our own research in this intersectional space. That means we need sufficient housing, sufficient numbers of housing that's affordable to a pet-keeping family, regardless of their income, located in a well-resourced neighborhood, free of breed, weight, or number restrictions beyond, for example, what local health and safety codes might dictate, and is free of non-refundable pet fees at all, including pet rent. And I know this is very aspirational, right? Like we are nowhere close to having this. And so I think that if we want to take a chunk out of this and we want to focus just on what it's going to take to reduce this intake due to pet-related restrictions, we have to be focused on policies that are addressing racial inequity in access to pet-inclusive housing, that are addressing economic inequity to pet-inclusive housing in high-opportunity neighborhoods, that take a broader view of what pet-inclusive means, not just breed, weight, and size, but also getting at the affordability issues. And we really should be advocating increasingly, and we do, for legislative appropriations for funding for the provision of direct support for tenants who are in a situation right now and they need support. And my colleagues who do this direct services work need more funding. And if we want to try to stem the flow of this in the short term, then we need more direct assistance to tenants with pets. I do just want to flag here the Rose et al., Applebaum et al. This is the 3rd study that my research cohort has published. It's called Pet Friendly for Whom? And we looked at the prevalence of pet fees in rental housing in multiple cities across the state of Texas, and found not only that particularly Latino, Latinx households were experiencing greater pet burden in terms of keeping pets in rental homes, but that lower income households or census tracts were more likely to have additional pet fees to begin with at rental housing. And so I just want to highlight this Rose study that I mentioned and the Applebaum study. I'll just end on some ongoing research. I'm very excited to be collaborating with the Institute for Human-Animal Connection again on a study to assess the effectiveness of pet deposit assistance as an intervention, supporting companions and animals for reform and equity care, doing their legal research behind a mass media Know Your Rights campaign for tenants with pets, and then with Dr. Jenny Applebaum from University of Florida, who is hopefully my research partner for life, and Dr. Becky Nemec at the Animal Human Policy Center at Colorado State University. We are assessing whether the regulation of pet policies negatively impacts pets allowed housing in general. So spoil alert, it doesn't. So landlords, the associations will often say, well, if you don't allow us to charge whatever rents we want to charge, or you don't allow us to discriminate on the basis of breed, we're just going to stop allowing pets at all. That's what we hear in testimony in the advocacy space. And although we haven't published this data yet, we are seeing that that is not the case in our sort of in situ experiments after legislation has passed. So with that, thanks for having me today, and thank you to all of my collaborators and the participants, the tenants and the Houston community groups who shared their stories with us, and to the organizations that have provided data or funding for this research. And that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Lauren. We have some time for questions. So I'm going to walk around the microphone for the benefit of the folks on Zoom. And then if we have any on Zoom, we can do that as well. Okay, Jackie, I'm coming. Let me get my exercise here.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm currently a research track student mentored by Dr. Megan at the MAP program. So I have a question. So when I rent my house, I'm quite confused because I look around. Almost all the pet-friendly housing restrict the number of 2 pets per household. I want to know if there are any resource-based things to illustrate that why the number of 2 are limited.
That's a great question. So we identify those numbers as arbitrary. So I think that all of the restrictions, numbers, breed, otherwise, they're all an attempt to minimize risk, right, for the landlord, to minimize the risk of damage, to minimize the risk of harm. So over the years, there's just been this notion that 2 pets is, where we draw the line for where we decide that that risk is minimized. So some examples of reasons that I've heard for those limitations would be square footage. So if you live in a really, really small home, perhaps there's a justifiable reason for only allowing 2 pets. I would argue that there are people who can successfully and healthily and keep 10 pets, right? And then there are people who would struggle with just 1. Like, it just is totally person specific. And often these restrictions in the housing policies themselves are more strict than the local law. So for example, there are cities that will say you can have up to 5 cats and 3 dogs in your home. Like, that's a city law, right? That's based on some sort of, theoretically, health and safety kind of consideration. But the housing providers can say, well, we're going to be more strict than the local law. Even publicly funded housing, which theoretically should probably be abiding by local standards. Yeah.
It's on now. I just wanted to ask, have you noticed a difference in between corporate-run apartment complexes versus private-run complexes?
Yeah, another great question. I don't have any data on that at this point to really be able to speak to trends. And I think that's quite jurisdictional. But I will say that corporate-owned, there's also this new-ish part of the industry that are individuals buying in to these business models that allow individuals to invest in rental housing. So that sort of blurs the line between corporate and individual, owned and operated housing. But I will say that corporate-owned affordable housing, or corporate-owned housing, market rate housing especially, if they are owned by a corporation that has shareholders, there is a fiduciary duty for that business and the decision makers of that business to increase profitability on behalf of those shareholders, right? So it's a complete conflict of interest, in my opinion, to be providing housing, which is a basic human right, and also being, legally obligated to run your business in a manner that prioritizes profit over everything else. So I do think that in the corporate-owned spaces, we see a lot of those of consistently high pet rents, non-refundable fees, and things like that. On the flip side, those properties also have incentive to decrease the use of breed, weight, size restrictions, right, to become more pet-friendly, because there are so many economic benefits to allowing pets in rental housing. So I think we might see increased numbers of pets allowed housing without major breed, weight, or size restrictions because of the profitability of pet keeping tenants. But at the same time, we're going to see them trying to profit on the keeping of those pets.
I have a question from Zoom.
Is it from my dad?
No. Yeah.
Hi, Dad.
We actually have a few, but I wanted to also give people here a chance, so we might go back and forth. So the first question is wondering about the impact of the lack of pet-inclusive housing on mental health. A suicide followed forced relinquishment due to a pet that has resulted in a positive pet policy in a local authority, the John Chadwick Pet Policy Maidstone.
Yeah. So I think here we would typically talk about the concept of emotional support animals to support people who are experiencing particularly mental health issues. And we have federal protections for emotional support animals in the US. So if somebody and most people I think would say that they get mental health benefits from their pets, right? But if somebody has a relationship with a therapist, that therapist can write, or not even just a therapist, anybody who knows the relationship between the pet and the person can write an emotional support animal letter. And that letter has to be accepted by a housing provider. And if somebody has an emotional support animal, they are not subject to additional fees, and they're not subject to any breed, weight, or size restrictions that might otherwise apply to just companion animals. So I think for the intersection with mental health issues, there's a lot of leaning on the ESA as a protection.
Oh.
Is it? Okay. Oh, so along those lines, do you think that there's been an abuse of ESA classification? There's so many people who are trying to do housing with their pets. I've anecdotally easy to get an ESA certificate.
Yeah, great question. So my short answer is no. I don't think that there has been an abuse of ESAs. And I'll tell you I have two reasons for that. One, I think that so many people in our country experience moderate to severe mental and emotional health crises that go undiagnosed, that go untreated, and pets play a really important role in helping folks navigate that in their daily lives. So I think that if you get emotional support from your pet, you have anxiety, you have depression, and your pet helps you get out the door and go for walks every day, it helps provide the structure and the framework you need to go keep your job, then I think that does and should continue to qualify for an ESA. The second reason is that I very strongly align with this notion of housing first. And I don't know if folks are familiar with that notion, but it basically means access to housing at all costs, at whatever the cost is, right? So I believe that if ESAs are a way for somebody to be able to keep their pet and get into their housing, and they have a relationship with somebody, a therapist, a doctor, or otherwise, who will vouch for that relationship, then I think that is absolutely an appropriate use of ESAs. Now, service animals are a different conversation than emotional support animals. So I do just want to add that delineation there.
Sorry. Okay. So I'm right there with you. I agree that housing is absolutely a human right, but that's a positive right that our Constitution does not acknowledge. Are there any states that have included a right to housing in their state constitutions that could be helpful in kind of advancing this cause?
Yeah, I wish that the answer was yes. I don't believe that there are, although I am not familiar enough with state constitutions to be able to answer that 100%. But to my knowledge, there is not a U.S. jurisdiction that has identified housing as like you're saying, an affirmative human right. The Constitution doesn't really affirmatively protect very many human rights in general. So there's a lot of gaps in what the Constitution protects. There are some international works that do talk about and provide examples of language that would define housing as a human right. But I don't think that there's a state that has done that. I could be wrong. I don't think so. Unfortunately. One day.
I have another one. The clinic I work at allows clients to apply for short-term loans to get clients access to pet care while not impacting the company's ability to pay employees. Has there been research into pet-related debt and low income?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that. I would say there is a disparate ability for lower income people to access credit more broadly, right? If you don't have a decent credit score, then you struggle to access credit, including like care credit, which is like in the veterinary space, right? You have to have a certain credit score to access care credit. But I am not sure. I don't have specific data. I would say probably the abuses would come from not being able to access low interest or no interest credit, while then also being subject to the abuses that come with payday credit lending and the whole nother can of worms that is payday lending.
Hi, thank you so much. I had a question about what sort of research you think is needed, especially thinking in the insurance, homeowner insurance, and breed-specific legislation and policies. What sort of research do you think is most needed to help alleviate some of those restrictions?
Yeah. I will caveat that the insurance space is not my major focus area. So if my colleagues who are really active in the insurance space are listening on Zoom, feel free to comment. But, you know, in the arguments with legislators, some of the, it's been a lot of defensive work, right, in identifying that you really can't genetically tell what breed a dog is, right? So we misidentify pit bull type dogs as pit bulls all the time. So there has been some research that has been, I think, a really effective talking point in that space, actually from some of the companies that do dog DNA testing. They're providing some really interesting data for those conversations. Always research around showing or helping to alleviate the fear. So there's a lot of threat of damage that like the pit bull type dogs or other dogs that are commonly discriminated against cause. But what we know from the basic research that we do have is that that's really not, it doesn't play out in the data, right? Sure, there are dog bites that occur from those breeds, but there are like just as many dog bites, if not more, that are occurring from like Chihuahuas and Labradors, right? So I think anything kind of showing that can help distinguish between the fear, the threat, and the reality is really helpful, because in this space, we're always talking about minimizing risk for landlords. That's like the baseline thing that they want to hear, right? And that legislators want to hear is how do we address these threats of risk? I don't know, it's kind of a vague answer to your question, but I'm sure my colleagues have very specific research questions that they could send you. Thanks, Erin.
Okay, so coming from Math Plum, Val Benton. Hi, Val. Zooming out a bit further, is your team looking at the effect of short-term rentals like Airbnb on the affordable housing crisis as it relates to pet retention in home. I'm curious how much overlap there is.
Yeah. We have not dug into that, although I am sure probably the fee issue is really significant in short-term rentals. But there are other countries that have addressed that issue. I think France passed a law a while ago, like maybe a decade ago, that required short-term rentals to be wrapped up in their pet inclusive housing law. So there are other countries who have incorporated short-term rentals into their work. We have not gotten into that space yet.
Does anyone else have any questions in the room? Probably time for one more. No? Okay. Probably do one more online. Okay. Okay. Let's see. I'll try to project and hopefully they can hear me on Zoom. Can U.S. landlords require pet-owning tenants to have insurance to cover pet damage? The housing bill should soon be introduced in England that will allow landlords to request this, and landlords will not be allowed to unreasonably refuse a tenant to have a pet as a major advance in the UK.
Yeah. So landlords can require tenants to have additional pet-related security or insurances. It's not a requirement, but they can do it if they choose. And there are a couple of issues with that. One is that there are still many insurances that discriminate on the basis of breed. So there are a lot of tenants who cannot get separate insurance for their pets because they have a pit bull type dog and they won't be insured. So that's a real struggle with helping to minimize the risk for the landlords, is that it's still only certain people who can take advantage of it. And there's a cost association, right? Like that's especially for low income tenants, that is another added cost for a tenant to have in order to access the housing. So, but I do know that that is part of the conversation. But I think the real focus is just getting the insurance providers themselves to stop discriminating against certain groups of dogs.
Great, thank you. We are out of time. I know we could ask a bunch more questions of Lauren. So thank you so much, Lauren, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone for coming.